Imagine spending 70 years on a single project. Not a building, not a book, but a line. A 1,600-mile-long line of mathematical precision drawn right across a subcontinent. This is the incredible story of the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. One of the most ambitious and, frankly, one of the most dangerous scientific missions in history. So let's dive into the story of the Great Arc. So picture this. It's July 1819. A young Lieutenant George Everest, and yes, we're talking about that Everest, is leading a team of 150 men deep into the Indian jungle. The monsoon is about to hit, and they are completely cut off from the world. You have to understand that this wasn't just some inconvenient delay. This was a desperate fight for survival against everything nature could throw at them. And I mean everything. The environment was just relentlessly hostile. We're talking about tigers and wild boars roaming the forest floor, boa constrictors, and literally bird-sized spiders hanging in the trees. And when that monsoon finally did strike, the dry riverbeds they were camping in turned into raging torrents overnight. It was a total nightmare. Within weeks, almost every single person in Everest's party was struck down by a crippling fever. Which just makes you wonder, right? Why on earth would anyone put themselves through all of this? Why risk your life against malaria, monsoons, and tigers? All for what? Just to draw a few lines on a map? What was the point? Well, the answer, like a lot of things back in the 19th century, boils down to two things: empire and money. See, this was never just a scientific quest for knowledge. It was a crucial tool for colonial administration. By the year 1800, the British East India Company was basically the ruler of huge parts of India. But to really control that territory, to tax the land, to administer it effectively, they needed to know exactly what they owned down to the last acre. Their old maps, based on wandering rivers and local landmarks, they just weren't going to cut it anymore. They needed precision. And that is where an infantry officer named William Lambton steps onto the stage. He proposed something that was just truly radical for the time: to map the entire subcontinent, not by sketching what you see, but by using this incredibly rigorous mathematical method on a scale nobody had ever even dreamed of. So how in the world do you map a country that massive with 19th century technology? The answer was this brilliant, elegant, but oh so difficult idea from geometry. The method is called triangulation, and the basic idea is actually pretty simple. If you know the exact length of one side of a triangle, we'll call that the baseline, and you know the two angles at either end of that line, you can mathematically calculate the exact position of that third point plus the lengths of the other two sides. Simple, right? But here's where it gets really clever. Once you figured out your first triangle, you can use one of those newly calculated sides as the baseline for the next triangle, and then the next one, and the one after that. By creating this long, interlocking chain of triangles, you can literally map your way across enormous distances with incredible accuracy. And when I say meticulous, I mean they were absolutely fanatical about it. First, they'd measure a single baseline, and that alone could take almost 2 months to get it perfect down to the fraction of an inch. Then, they'd use this instrument called a theodolite to measure the angles to some distant peak or tower. Then came the math. And then they'd move on. And here's the genius part. They were constantly making these tiny, complex corrections for everything imaginable, from how the temperature was affecting their measuring chains to the curvature of the Earth itself. And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this whole operation, their main instrument, the Great Theodolite, weighed half a ton. It took a team of 12 men just to carry the thing. The logistics of this project were just as monumental as the calculations. Now, an undertaking this massive, one that lasted for over 70 years, well, it was obviously about way more than just one or two people. This was a multi-generational epic, and it was filled with some truly remarkable characters. The two guys who really defined the survey were total polar opposites. You had William Lambton, the founder. He was the scientific idealist, driven by this pure quest for knowledge. And then you had his successor, George Everest, who was brilliant, for sure, but also famously difficult, short-tempered, a perfectionist who drove his team into the ground, but who also perfected the survey's methods and instruments. But some of the most fascinating figures in this whole story were the pundits. When the survey finally got to the Himalayas, they hit a wall. Countries like Tibet and Nepal were completely closed off to Europeans. So what did they do? They recruited and trained local men from the border regions to go in undercover, disguised as traders or holy men, and map these forbidden lands in total secret. And their training was just extraordinary. I mean, since they couldn't exactly carry a half-ton theodolite with them, they learned to measure distance with their own bodies. Each pundit was trained to walk with a stride so perfectly consistent that they took exactly 2,000 paces to cover 1 mile, every single time, over mountains, through valleys, day in and day out. The spycraft they came up with was just brilliant. They adapted everyday religious items for espionage. Their Buddhist prayer beads, their mala, it had 100 beads instead of the usual 108, so they could use it as an abacus to count their paces. They hollowed out prayer wheels to hide tiny scrolls of paper where they'd record their data. They even turned their secret observations into rhyming poems to help them memorize crucial details without writing anything down.
So after decades and decades of battling jungles, deserts, disease, and politics, the survey finally reached its grand finale, the roof of the world. By the 1840s, this massive, unbroken chain of triangles, the Great Arc, stretched all the way from the southern coast of India right up to the foothills of the Himalayas. For the first time ever, they had a perfect, mathematically sound launch pad from which they could measure those colossal peaks off in the distance. From observation stations that were more than 100 miles away, they took dozens and dozens of readings of this one distant, snow-covered peak, which they knew only by a code name, Peak XV. After years of painstaking calculations, correcting for every variable you can think of, light refraction, the Earth's curvature, you name it, the survey's chief computer, a man named Rodnath Shikhar, finally figured out its height. He calculated it to be precisely 29,000 feet. They had done it. They had found the highest point on the planet. Andrew Wall, who was Everest's successor, proposed naming the mountain after his old boss, and just like that, Peak XV became Mount Everest. What they didn't realize at the time was that it already had a local Tibetan name, Chomolungma, which means goddess mother of the world. The renaming decision really remains a mark of the colonial nature of the whole project. Now, measuring Everest was, of course, the survey's most famous achievement, but believe it or not, its true legacy is even more profound. First off, the accuracy they achieved was it's hard to even comprehend. As a way to check their work, after triangulating for hundreds of miles, they would stop and physically measure a new baseline. In one famous case, their calculated baseline of over 7 miles differed from the actual measured length by less than 4 inches. I mean, think about that. With 19th century tools, it's just a stunning testament to their skill. And the project's impact went way beyond just making maps. When the surveyors started noticing these really strange gravitational readings near the Himalayas, it led to a completely revolutionary new theory. They figured out the only way to explain the weirdly weak gravitational pull was if the massive mountains were actually made of lighter rock that was floating on the denser mantle below, kind of like a giant iceberg floating in the Earth's crust. This idea became the foundation for the modern geological theory of isocity. So it is absolutely no exaggeration to say that the Great Trigonometrical Survey was a true landmark of human achievement. A contemporary assessment at the time hailed it as, quote, one of the most stupendous works in the whole history of science. It didn't just map a nation and give a name to the world's highest peak, it fundamentally changed our understanding of the very planet we live on.